The nine-tailed cat, a symphony of cruelty. Surges of sea waves were often accompanied by the cruel symphony of the nine-tailed cat. The sharp, ominous whistle of leather cutting through the air, accompanied by the disgusting thud of blows on bare skin, echoed across the wooden decks of ships for centuries. It was the sound of the nine-tailed whip, a terrifying instrument of punishment that instilled unshakable fear in the hearts of sailors and pirates alike. The practice of flogging, especially with this multi-tailed whip, was a harsh reality of maritime life, leaving deep physical and indelible psychological scars on those unlucky enough to experience its bite. As the respected naval historian N.A.M. Roger once eloquently wrote, "The nine-tailed cat was the voice of naval discipline, speaking a language understood by every sailor. The cat o' nine tails, often referred to simply as the cat, was a special whip consisting of 9 knotted ropes attached to a sturdy handle. Each rope was usually about 2 feet long and made of thin rope or raw hide. For maximum effect, these ropes were sometimes decorated with metal fragments or even pieces of glass. The origin of this distinctive name is shrouded in maritime legends. Some theories suggest that it derives from the popular belief that cats have 9 lives, while others link it to the characteristic scratches it left on its victim's back. Interestingly, the term nine-tailed cat first appeared in print in 1681 in Thomas Otis's play The Soldier's Fortune, although the instrument itself had been in active use long before this literary reference. Flogging, as a general form of naval discipline, dates back to ancient times, but its widespread and brutal use reached its peak during the Age of Sail, which lasted from the 16th to the 19th century. In the British Royal Navy, flogging was officially sanctioned in 1661, when the Articles of War were formally adopted. These articles, which comprehensively regulated military discipline in the Navy, gave captains the right to use flogging for a wide range of offenses, from relatively minor offenses such as drunkenness to more serious crimes such as theft or mutiny. The infamous Captain William Kidd, who later became a pirate, first served as a privateer and was known for his liberal use of the cane. In 1695, while commanding the ship Adventure Galley, he flogged a crew member for insubordination, which was an ominous sign of his subsequent reputation as a cruel man. One of the most famous cases of flogging occurred in 1797 aboard the HMS Hermione. Captain Hugh Pigot, notorious for his sadistic tendencies, ordered several sailors to be flogged for what he considered to be slow sailing during a storm. The extreme cruelty of the punishment, during which one man was beaten to death, led to a bloody mutiny. The desperate sailors rose up, killed Pigot and several of his officers, and then threw their bodies overboard. This shocking event deeply shook the British Admiralty and sparked serious discussions about the urgent need to reform the practice of flogging. Admiral Lord St. Vincent, upon hearing news of the mutiny on the Hermione, uttered the famous phrase, "I fear the cat of 9 tails must answer for this terrible affair." The number of strokes varied greatly depending on the nature of the offense, and often on the whim of the captain. Minor offenses could be punished with 12 strokes, while more serious crimes could result. In 1812, aboard the ship Chesapeake, Commodore James Barron ordered 500 lashes with a sea cane to be administered to a sailor named Robert Jeffreys for what seemed to be a minor offense, stealing cheese. Jeffrey miraculously survived this horrific ordeal, but many others were not so lucky. Infections from severe wounds were common, and death from excessive blood loss or shock was not uncommon. In 1731, a British sailor named John Barr received 500 lashes for desertion. He survived the first flogging but tragically died 3 days later from his wounds, prompting one officer to grimly note in his log, "The cat has taken another of its 9 lives." Pirates, despite their reputation as people operating outside the law, also used flogging as a primary means of maintaining discipline among their ranks. The infamous pirate Bartholomew Roberts, often called Black Bart, explicitly included flogging in his ship's rules. His code stated that any man who strikes another while these articles are in force shall be punished according to the law of Moses, that is, 40 lashes, except one, on the bare back. This biblical reference to 39 lashes was a common form of punishment, widely believed to be the maximum a man could endure without dying. Edward Lowe, another notorious pirate active in the 1720s, became famous for his creative and particularly cruel use of the cat o' nine tails. On one occasion, he reportedly flogged a captured captain with a cat dipped in brine, adding a painful layer of suffering to an already brutal punishment. The psychological impact of flogging was as severe and debilitating as the physical punishment itself. Admiral John Jarvis, Earl of St. Vincent, once remarked that discipline on a ship is maintained by fear of punishment. This deep fear was palpable among the crew whenever flogging was imminent. Usually all sailors were called to watch the punishment, which was given the sinister name of cat watching. The victim was usually tied to a grating or mast, exposing his back to the ship's surgeon stood nearby, ostensibly to determine whether the punishment should be stopped, but this was often a mere formality. Samuel Leach, a sailor who served in the British and American navies, vividly described in his memoirs that Punishment Day was always a day of horror on the ship, and that the atmosphere of deathly silence that descended on the ship when the crew gathered to watch the scene was painfully oppressive. Another sailor, Jack Ugly Face, described in his memoirs the grim aftermath of flogging. When he was taken down, he was carried to the sick bay, where the doctor dressed his wounds with marinade. It was many days before he could perform his duties, and several weeks before his shirt could touch his back. The widespread practice of using salt water to clean open wounds further exacerbated an already agonizing ordeal. In 1811, a young midshipman named Frederick Marryat witnessed a particularly brutal flogging aboard HMS Imperieuse. He later became a well-known writer and used his experience to vividly describe flogging in his books, playing an important role in changing public opinion about the practice. However, not all captains were ardent supporters of flogging. Captain William Bligh, despite his reputation after the mutiny on the Bounty, was known for rarely using flogging. In his journal from 1787, he wrote, "I punished Sailor John Bowman with 12 lashes for disobedience and disrespect." This man had recently been punished for similar offenses. Bligh's relative restraint in the use of punishment was highly unusual for his time. Similarly, Captain James Cook, during his extensive voyages of exploration in the 1770s, used flogging as a last resort. He preferred alternative punishments, such as confinement to quarters or reduction in rations. Believing that excessive flogging demoralized, the practice of flogging began to decline in the 19th century, as public opinion gradually turned against its barbarity. Charles Dickens, in his influential novel David Copperfield, vividly described flogging as a horrible spectacle, which further reinforced public opinion. In 1850, the U.S. Congress took an important step by limiting the maximum number of lashes to 12. Then, in 1862, flogging was officially abolished in the U.S. Navy. The British Royal Navy followed suit, abolishing the practice in 1879, although it retained flogging as a punishment specifically for mutiny until 1881. Herman Melville, who served in the U.S. Navy and later wrote the iconic novel Moby Dick, was a fierce critic of flogging. In his novel White Jacket, he wrote, "However childish, ignorant, and inexperienced a man may be, he demands respect for his courage, but he is beaten like a dog." Being marooned on a deserted island was not just a plot device in fantasy stories, but a very real and terrifying consequence for those who dared to cross their fellow pirates. The legendary pirate captain Bartholomew Roberts once proclaimed, "A merry life and a short one. That's my motto," words that took on a grim and ironic tone for those doomed to a slow death on forgotten shores. The exact origins of marooning can be traced back to the early days of maritime exploration. The term itself is believed to come from the Spanish word cimarron, which originally referred to escaped cattle or slaves in the Caribbean. By the 17th century, the term had evolved to mean the act of leaving a person in a remote, uninhabited place. Interestingly, this practice was not limited to the New World. Historical records show that as early as 1509, Portuguese explorer Francisco de Almeida marooned mutineers on a remote island in the Indian Ocean, demonstrating the global nature of this romanticized as a realm of boundless adventure and daring exploration, was a much bleaker reality for many sailors and pirates who plied their trade on the oceans of the world. Beneath its romantic facade, maritime life was governed by a brutal system of justice, replete with horrific punishments. As the famous 18th-century English writer Samuel Johnson grimly observed, to be in a prison with the probability of drowning. This sentiment accurately reflected the reality of those who were subjected to extreme forms of punishment, both by maritime powers and, at times, by the criminals they pursued. This study examines 4 of the most notorious and brutal maritime punishments: keelhauling, flogging with a 9-tailed whip, isolation on a desert island, and the chilling spectacle of death by hanging. Each served as a stark reminder of the ruthless nature of life at sea, and what authorities, whether state or self-appointed, were willing to do to maintain order. It is important to note that although these punishments are often associated with piracy and popular culture, they were used much more widely in history, and were no less, if not more, prevalent in naval discipline than in pirate justice. In this article, we will rely exclusively on historical sources to shed light on the grim reality of these practices. Keeling, trial by water. The sounds of a ship, the rhythmic creaking of wooden planks and the gentle lapping of waves against the hull, usually conjure up images of adventure. But for some unfortunate people in the history of seafaring, these sounds heralded a terrible ordeal. Keeling. This punishment, so severe that it could strike fear into even the most experienced sailors, is a chilling testament to the brutal justice that reigned on the high seas. The practice of keeling originated in the Dutch Navy in the 17th century. The term itself comes from the Dutch word keelen, meaning to drag under the keel. Although keel hauling is often mistakenly associated primarily with pirates, it was mainly used by naval forces as a disciplinary measure against their own crew members. The Dutch, particularly renowned for their seafaring skills during the golden age of the 17th century, were notorious for their strict use of this cruel method to maintain discipline on their ships. One of the first documented cases of keel hauling dates back to 1622. A Dutch sailor named Pilgrim Willem was subjected to this horrific punishment for striking his captain. The incident occurred aboard the ship Hollandia, while it was anchored off the coast of what is now Jakarta, Indonesia. Surprisingly, survived this ordeal, although his fate served as a grim warning to other sailors who might consider insubordination. The severity of the punishment was officially enshrined in the Dutch Articles of War, published in 1629 by Stadtholder Frederick Henry, Prince of Orange. These articles officially sanctioned keel hauling as a punishment for serious offenses, including, among other things, mutiny, theft, or sodomy. These strict articles remained in force for more than 2 centuries, having a profound influence on the harsh disciplinary culture that prevailed in the Dutch Navy. The keel hauling process was carried out with meticulous cruelty. First, the condemned man was stripped naked and then tightly bound with ropes. Often, weights were tied to him so that the unfortunate man would sink deep enough to pass completely under the keel of the ship. Then the crew members set about the gruesome task of dragging the victim from one side of the ship to the other, dragging him under the hull, which was usually covered with razor-sharp shells and other marine growths. In some cases, a wooden board or even a mattress was tied to the victim's back, apparently in a symbolic attempt to provide some protection. However, this often proved useless against the tearing shells and the enormous pressure of the water. For those who were subjected to this torture, it was a real nightmare. Captain Charles Johnson, in his influential book, A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, gave a vivid, though perhaps sensational, description of this ordeal. The offender shall be stripped naked, and a rope tied around his waist, by which he shall be hoisted up to the yard-arm, from whence he shall be thrown into the sea and dragged under the keel of the ship. Despite some exaggeration, Johnson's account provides a rare contemporary description of this punishment and has largely shaped our modern understanding of maritime punishment during the golden age of piracy. The chances of survival for a person subjected to keel hauling were extremely slim. If the victim did not drown immediately, they faced certain death from sharp shells and other marine organisms attached to the hull of the ship. Even those who miraculously survived being dragged through the water often suffered serious cuts, broken bones, and significant internal injuries. Many of the survivors tragically died from their wounds or subsequent infections within days of the punishment. Military records of the Dutch East India Company indicate that the mortality rate from keel hauling could reach 50%, cementing its reputation as one of the most terrifying punishments at sea. A particularly harrowing first-hand account is contained in the diary of naval chaplain John Thong. In 1676, Thonger witnessed keelhauling aboard HMS Assistance. He recorded, "In a single moment, he was pulled from one side of the ship under the keel to the other, his body so badly scratched that it was almost impossible to restore him." Tonger's account provides a rare, unromanticized glimpse into the brutal reality of this punishment, contrasting sharply with later artistic depictions in literature and film. Although the Dutch Navy was known for its widespread use of keelhauling, other European navies also adopted this cruel punishment. The Russian Navy, under the leadership of the ambitious Tsar Peter I, adopted the practice in the early 18th century, as part of a broader effort to modernize its naval forces along Western lines. In 1705, Peter IV personally watched the keel-hauling of several sailors accused of theft on a ship in the port of. The Tsar reportedly approved of the practice, noting that it was an excellent means of maintaining discipline. The emperor's approval ensured that keel-hauling remained an integral part of Russian naval discipline until the 19th century. Surprisingly, keel-hauling was never officially sanctioned by the British Royal Navy. Although there were occasional reports of unofficial cases of this punishment being used, it never gained official recognition. Admiral John Binge mentioned in his mid-18th century memoirs that he had witnessed keel-hauling on board a British ship, although he personally condemned the practice as barbaric and un-English. Similarly, the French Navy largely refrained from this practice, considering it excessively barbaric, even by the standards of the distinguished French naval officer and explorer Louis-Antoine de Bougainville expressed this opinion in his diary in 1766, writing that such cruelty is unworthy of a civilized nation and serves only to harden the hearts of men. Contrary to popular belief and frequent depictions in pirate lore, keel-hauling was not a common punishment among pirates. Usually preferred quicker and less complicated forms of punishment or execution, such as marooning on a deserted island or walking the plank. However, the threat of keel-hauling was often used to instill fear and maintain order on pirate ships. For example, in the infamous Pirate Code established by Bartholomew Roberts in 1721, keel-hauling is not mentioned. Instead, the code emphasizes more practical forms of punishment, such as flogging or marooning on a deserted island. One of the infamous pirates who allegedly used keel-hauling was Edward Lowe, who operated in the 1720s, and was known for his sadistic tendencies. Law is reported to have keel-hauled prisoners from merchant ships he had plundered. One account describes in detail how Law keel-hauled the captain of a captured ship off the coast of Newfoundland in 1723, allegedly because he refused to reveal the location of hidden valuables. However, these accounts are largely based on sensational stories, and are more likely to be legend than verifiable fact, as much of Lowe's fearsome reputation comes from secondary sources and folklore. The cruelty inherent in keel-hauling did not escape the attention of contemporary critics. In 1749, the influential French philosopher Montesquieu, in his seminal work The Spirit of Laws, unequivocally condemned the practice, writing that keeling should be prohibited in all countries, as it is contrary to humanity. Montesquieu's criticism reflected a growing opinion among Enlightenment thinkers that such extreme forms of punishment were incompatible with the ideals of a civilized society. Despite its grim reputation as a cruel punishment, keel-hauling persisted in some navies until the 19th century. The last officially recorded case of keel-hauling in the Dutch Navy occurred in 1853 aboard the frigate USS Frubber. The victim, a sailor named Johannes Franken, survived the ordeal but suffered severe injuries. The incident caused considerable public outrage in the Netherlands, and was one of the main reasons for the practice's eventual abolition in the country. In Russia, keelboarding was officially abolished in 1864 as part of broader naval reforms carried out under Tsar Alexander II. In a cage of shame, when the salty wind carried the cold smell of decay across the harbor, crowds gathered to gawk at the gruesome spectacle. Swaying in the wind, encased in rusty iron, the remains of once fearsome pirates served as a grim and terrifying reminder of the price of lawlessness on the high seas. This was the practice of or hanging in chains, a horrific form of execution and posthumous punishment that struck fear into the hearts of both would-be pirates and ordinary people alike. The renowned pirate historian Marcus Rediker once aptly wrote that the gibbet was a state theater of death, a grim stage on which the power of authority was displayed for all to see. Hanging on the gibbet, a practice that reached its chilling peak in the 17th and 18th centuries, was not simply an act of execution, but a prolonged public display of the condemned. After hanging, the body of the criminal, most often a pirate, was placed in an iron cage or frame specially designed for this purpose, known as a gibbet. These horrific human exhibits were strategically placed near busy ports, river mouths, or major crossroads, ensuring maximum visibility and serving as a powerful deterrent to anyone who might consider a life of maritime crime. In 1722, the infamous pirate Edward Lowe narrowly escaped this gruesome fate by managing to slip away from his pursuers off the coast of Boston. His lieutenant, Charles Harris, was not so lucky. Harris was hanged on a gallows at the entrance to Charleston Harbor, and his rotting corpse grimly greeted ships entering the busy South Carolina port for several months. One of the most notorious cases of pirate hanging was that of William Kidd, whose controversial career as a privateer turned pirate ended in a brutal death in 1701. After a high-profile trial in London, Kidd was hanged at Execution Dock in Wapping. His body was then placed in a gallows and hung over the River Thames at Tilbury Point, where it remained for 3 agonizing years. Kidd's decomposing body served as a grim and unforgettable navigational landmark for ships entering and leaving London, a fate he shared with many of his fellow pirates. The poet John Gay, in his 1728 The Beggar's Opera, mentioned this gruesome sight with the line, "There hangs the pirate Kidd in chains," forever imprinting the image of Kidd on the gallows in the public consciousness for many generations. The meticulous process of constructing a gallows was a cruel art in itself. Gallows were often custom-made for a specific criminal, with iron hoops surrounding the neck, torso, and limbs. Some gallows were even equipped with a small cage specifically for the head, so that even after the body had decomposed, the skull would remain in place, smiling menacingly at passers-by. Blacksmith John Fern, who made gallows in the 18th century, once grimly remarked, "Every cage is an iron portrait of the wretch it is meant to hold." In 1752, the body of James Field, a smuggler executed in Kent, England, was placed in a gallows so well made that it held his remains intact for more than 2 decades, earning it the nickname Field's Iron Skirt. The length of time that remains could be preserved on a gallows varied greatly depending on weather conditions and the strength of the gallows themselves. In some horrific cases, bodies could hang for years, or even decades. Pirate George Wood, executed in 1765, swung in his iron cage on Beacon Hill in Halifax, Nova Scotia, for more than 20 years. Local legends claimed that on stormy nights, Wood's ghost could be heard rattling his chains, a grim reminder of his earthly punishment. Similarly, the body of John Brads, executed for murder in 1742, hung from the gallows in Rye, England, for 50 years. The extraordinary durability of the gallows led to the emergence of a local saying, "Live like Brads," when referring to something long-lasting. Although the gallows were clearly intended to deter crime, they often had unintended consequences, attracting large crowds, and paradoxically, even arousing sympathy for the condemned. When the notorious pirate Charles Vane was hanged on the gallows in Port Royal, Jamaica, in 1721, witnesses reported that the crowd's initial bloodlust gradually gave way to a somber, contemplative mood as they witnessed the pirate's gruesome fate. One observer noted, "Even the most hardened among us must pause at such a sight and reflect on the fragility of human life." In 1786, the hanging of William Jobling, a miner executed for murder in Durham, England, attracted such a huge crowd that local authorities genuinely feared riots. It is reported that Jobling's wife came to the gallows every night, which further heightened public anxiety and discomfort about the practice of hanging on a pillory was not limited to the Caribbean and the American colonies. In England, the Murder Act of 1751 explicitly added hanging on a pillory as a punishment specifically for murderers, firmly establishing its place in the judicial system. This law led to a significant increase in the number of cases of hanging on the pillory. According to some estimates, between 1752 and 1832, more than 100 criminals were hanged on the pillory in England. One of the most famous cases was that of Eugene Aram, a philologist turned murderer, whose body was hanged in 1759, a leap into the cold creak of weathered wood beneath trembling feet, the salty sea wind carrying whispers of impending doom, and the ominous splash awaiting below. These are the elements that make up the terrifying picture of walking the plank. This infamous punishment, often depicted in romantic tales of pirates and Hollywood blockbusters, carried with it the weight of reality, as chilling as the waters that engulfed its victims. As the infamous pirate Blackbeard, Edward Teach, once growled, "Cursed be the lands that seize my soul if I give you mercy or take it from you," words that reflect the cruel finality of such a fate. Although not as common as popular culture might suggest, the practice of forcing prisoners or mutinous crew members to walk the plank into the merciless sea was indeed employed by some of the most notorious pirates in history. The exact origins of this brutal spectacle remain shrouded in the fog of maritime legend. However, evidence of its use dates back to the golden age of piracy in the 17th and 18th centuries. Interestingly, the specific term, walking the plank, only appeared in print in the early 19th century, with one of the first references found in Francis Grose's 1796 Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue, where it is described as a punishment administered by pirates to their captives. One of the earliest recorded instances of walking the plank comes from the account of Dutch sailor Jan Erasmus Rinning in 1663. Rinning witnessed pirate captain François Lolon forcing several Spanish captives to walk the plank off the coast of Venezuela. Lolon, known for his deeply sadistic tendencies, reportedly laughed as he watched his victims fall into shark-infested waters. This chilling act of cruelty set a grim precedent that was later followed by other pirates seeking to instill fear in both their captives and their own crew. Lologne, whose real name was Jean-David No, was known for his extreme cruelty. In one particularly horrific case, he reportedly cut out and ate the heart of a Spanish captive who refused to give up information. The infamous English pirate Bartholomew Roberts, also known as Black Bart, is said to have used a plank as a means of punishment and cruel entertainment. In 1720, off the coast of Newfoundland, Roberts captured the slave ship Samuel. According to reports, he forced the ship's captain, William Snelgrave, to watch in horror as his crew members were forced to walk the plank. Snelgrave later wrote about the experience, describing it as the most horrible sight that ever haunted him for many years. Roberts, who was active from 1719 to 1722, was one of the most successful pirates of his era, capturing more than 400 ships. Although his contract, a comprehensive code of conduct for pirates, included provisions such as every man shall have a voice in important matters, it also stipulated that desertion or theft from the common fund would be punished by being marooned on an uninhabited island or death. However, it was the fearsome Edward Lowe who truly embraced the theatrical cruelty of the plank. Operating in the 1720s, Lowe earned a terrifying reputation for exceptional cruelty, and walking the plank became one of his signature methods of torture. In 1722, Lowe captured the Portuguese ship Nostra de Victoria off the coast of Brazil. Enraged by the captain's attempt to hide some of his gold, Lowe forced him and several crew members to walk the plank. According to reports, Lowe extended the plank far over the side of the ship, deliberately prolonging the agonizing final moments of his victims as they slowly approached their watery grave. Lowe's reputation as a cruel man was so great that one contemporary categorically stated, "Lowe was the most famous pirate who ever lived, and no pirate of modern times can compare with him in cruelty and barbarity." The psychological impact of the plank was often as devastating as its physical consequences. Wrote of the pirates who captured him, "They forced me to stand on the edge of the deck, threatening to make me walk the plank and kill me if I did not tell them where the money was hidden." This psychological warfare was a common and effective tactic used by pirates. The notorious pirate Charles Vane, who operated in the Caribbean from 1716 to 1721, was known for frequently using the threat of the plank to extract information and valuables from his captives, often without actually resorting to it. However, not all stories about walking the plank ended. In 1769, the crew of the British merchant ship Betsy mutinied against their cruel captain and officers. Instead of killing them without trial, the mutineers decided to make them walk the plank. Surprisingly, the captain and two of his officers managed to survive by clinging to floating debris and were eventually rescued by a passing ship. This case, although rare, highlights the small, desperate chance of survival that some victims clung to as they took their last steps. The practice of walking the plank was not limited to the Caribbean Sea and the waters of the Atlantic Ocean. In the South China Sea, the notorious pirate Chong Jia, also known as Qing Shi, is said to have used this punishment on rival pirates and disobedient prisoners. Operating in the early 19th century, Qing Shi commanded a huge fleet of more than 300 ships and between 20,000 and 40,000 pirates. The use of the plank further cemented her fearsome reputation and helped maintain strict discipline in her vast maritime empire. Qing Shi's strict code of conduct included harsh punishments for crimes such as assaulting women and theft, but also clearly allowed extreme measures against enemies. She once proclaimed, "Under the leadership of the man you all decided to flee from, we will see how you fare under the hand of a woman." Despite its prominent place in pirate lore, walking the plank was not as common a form of punishment or execution as others. Keelhauling, marooning on a deserted island, and simple shooting or stabbing were often more convenient methods for pirates to get rid of unwanted individuals. The plank was usually used on special occasions when the pirate captain wanted to make a strong statement or entertain himself in a particularly cruel way. The infamous pirate Calico Jack Rackham, who operated in the Caribbean from 1718 to 1720, was known for preferring quick executions to prolonged spectacle with the plank. His mistress and comrade Anne Bonny reportedly punished captured sailors by saying, "If you had fought like men, you wouldn't have to hang like dogs." The last documented case of going overboard occurred in 1822 when Spanish pirate Bonito Du forced the passengers and crew of the Morning Star to jump overboard off the coast of Ascension Island. This grim event marked the definitive end of an era, as the golden age of piracy was rapidly coming to a close, and maritime powers were becoming increasingly effective at suppressing pirate activity. Du's career was relatively short. He was captured in 1830 and subsequently hanged in Gibraltar. Du's last words were, "I die believing in the faith of my ancestors," which stands in stark contrast to the ruthless deaths he inflicted on so many others. Today, the image of a trembling victim crawling across a narrow plank under the jibes of mocking pirates remains a powerful symbol of the cruelty and theatricality of pirate life. It has been immortalized in literature, from J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan to Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, and continues to capture the imagination of audiences in films and television shows. In Peter Pan, Captain Hook threatens his victims with the famous phrase, "Shut up, dogs, or I'll drop anchor in you," which reflects the menacing but almost cartoonish character that the board has acquired. Cases of landing on an uninhabited island occurred in 1502 during Christopher Columbus's fourth voyage to the New World. Columbus landed his mutinous crew member Francisco de Porras on the island of Jamaica. This decisive act set a frightening precedent that was followed by both naval forces and pirates in the centuries that followed. Columbus himself wrote in his diary, "Let them stay and live here, for this is the paradise they have chosen," a frighteningly dismissive statement about those he left behind. Pirates, however, elevated marooning to an art form, formally enshrining it in their codes of conduct and using it as a powerful tool to maintain strict order among their ranks. The infamous pirate Bartholomew Roberts, also known as Black Bart, explicitly included marooning on a deserted island in his Articles of Agreement. His code stated grimly, "If any man shall offer to escape or keep any secret from the company, he shall be set on a desert island with 1 bottle of powder, 1 bottle of water, 1 musket, and a load of shot." Roberts, who terrorized the seas from 1719 to 1722, was known for his strict adherence to this code, and reportedly marooned several crew members on deserted islands during his career. Among them was a carpenter named James Skur, who dared to challenge Roberts' authority. The meager supplies given to those cast ashore, a pistol with 1 bullet, a bottle of gunpowder, a bottle of water, and a few cartridges were often more of a cruel joke than a real lifeline. The pistol was not usually given for hunting or self-defense, but as a desperate means for the condemned to quickly end their own suffering, rather than endure a slow and painful death from hunger or cold. This grim rule was immortalized in Robert Louis Stevenson's novel, Treasure Island, where the character Billy Bones vividly recalls the terrible nature of pirates. Some feared Pew and some feared Flint, but Flint himself feared me. He feared that I feared him, and they prided themselves on being the most brutal crew on the sea. Even the devil himself feared to go to sea with them. But I'll tell you, I'm no braggart, and you can see for yourselves how easy I am to live with. But when I was quartermaster, Flint's old pirates weren't the sea dogs they were. Perhaps the most famous example of being marooned on a desert island in pirate lore is the story of Alexander Selkirk, whose extraordinary fate inspired Daniel Defoe to write his famous novel, Robinson Crusoe. In 1704, Scottish privateer Selkirk was marooned on the uninhabited island of Massa Tierra, now known as Robinson Crusoe Island, off the coast of Chile. Unlike the grim fate of most people marooned on a deserted island, Selkirk incredibly survived for 4 years and 4 months before he was finally rescued. His amazing story of survival captured the public's imagination and contributed greatly to the romanticization of being marooned on a deserted island in popular culture. Selkirk's trials began when he dared to question the seaworthiness of his ship, the Cinque Ports, leading to a heated argument with Captain Thomas Stradling. In a fit of anger, Selkirk demanded to be put ashore, a decision he undoubtedly soon regretted as he watched his ship sail away, leaving him with a musket, an axe, a knife, a pot, a Bible, and a few items of clothing. However, the reality of being marooned on a deserted island was much bleaker than in romantic tales. Most marooned pirates faced a grim and tragically short life. The legendary pirate Edward Lowe, known for his utterly sadistic tendencies, was particularly fond of marooning people on deserted islands. In 1722, he became infamous for marooning the entire crew of a captured Portuguese ship on a barren rock off the coast of Brazil, leaving them with only a few bottles of water. It is widely believed that none of them survived. Law's cruelty was well known, and one of his contemporaries wrote that Law was the most cruel and desperate of all pirates. He defied God and man, and delighted in torture and bloodshed. His tendency to abandon people on deserted islands was just one of the horrific aspects of his brutal reign at sea. Islands throughout the Caribbean, such as Dead Man's Chest in the British Virgin Islands, gained a grim reputation as favorite drop-off points for deserted islands. The name of the island itself, according to legend, comes from the pirates' custom of leaving a bottle of rum or spirits on the chest of their victims. Another infamous location was the Dry Tortugas, a group of small islands off the coast of Florida. These deserted, waterless reefs were a favorite landing place for pirates operating in the Gulf of Mexico. Playwright John Masefield captured the palpable horror of such places in his poem Spanish Waters, writing, "And there are dry Tortugas, where a man is left to rot, and his companions at sea forget, and the world remembers him not." Even the famous Blackbeard, Edward Teach, did not shy away from resorting to this punishment. In 1718, he marooned several members of his crew on a small sandy island in the Caribbean Sea when they dared to question his authority. It is said that only a few survived, rescued by passing ships several days later. Blackbeard's quartermaster William Howard later recounted the incident, saying, "Teach was the devil incarnate when he was crossed, and those poor wretches on the sandbar learned their lesson well." The psychological impact of being marooned on a deserted island was often as devastating as the physical suffering. Captain Charles Johnson, in his book A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, vividly described the deep mental anguish of those marooned on a deserted island. The fear of being left without provisions on a barren island, where there is little hope of survival, and no possibility of ever sailing away, must be a terrible ordeal for a human being. These agonizing feelings were shared by many survivors of desertion on uninhabited islands, including Philip Ashton, who was marooned by pirates on Rattan Island off the coast of Honduras in 1723. Ashton, who miraculously survived for 16 months before being rescued, later wrote, "Every day seemed like an eternity, and I often wished for death to relieve me of my torment. However, Not all cases of being marooned on a desert island ended. In 1722, Dutch pirate Jan de Groot was marooned on an uninhabited island off the coast of Madagascar by his own crew. Barnard not only survived, but also saved another group of shipwrecked sailors during his 2-year ordeal, demonstrating the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. With the beginning of the decline of the golden age of piracy in the early 18th century, the widespread practice of marooning people on uninhabited islands also fell out of favor. Naval forces gradually began to favor more formal methods of punishment, such as imprisonment or execution. However, the terrifying specter of being marooned on a desert island continued to haunt the imagination of sailors long after its practical application had become a thing of. The British Royal Navy officially banned marooning as a punishment in 1720, although isolated cases continued to occur. Admiral John Benbow, in his 1702 memoirs, reflected on the changing times. The practice of landing on uninhabited islands, once so common among pirates, is now considered barbaric by civilized nations, but its shadow still lingers in the minds of sailors. The last recorded case of pirates landing on an uninhabited island occurred in 1822, when Spanish pirate Bonito Du abandoned several crew members on a remote island in the Atlantic Ocean, after they objected to his cruel treatment of prisoners. This event marked the end of an era, but the chilling legend of being marooned on a deserted island lived on. Du's actions were widely condemned, even by other pirates, indicating a significant shift in the moral standards of sea robbers. One of his victims, who was later rescued, allegedly said, "Even among thieves there was once honor, but men like Du have cast aside all pretense of humanity." Noted that being marooned on a desert island was a microcosm of pirate society itself, a world where life was cheap, death was always close at hand, and only the strongest or luckiest survived.